There is an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay that has terrified some of the most hardened criminals in American history. A jagged, wind-battered rock, barely half a kilometer long and less than 200 meters wide, sitting just over 2 kilometers from the glittering California coastline. You can see it from the shore. On a clear day, you can almost make out the individual windows of its massive concrete fortress. It looks close enough to swim to. And that illusion, that deceptive promise of freedom, was perhaps the cruelest punishment Alcatraz ever inflicted on the men trapped inside its walls. The Spanish were the first Europeans to lay eyes on this barren outcrop. In 1775, Lieutenant Juan Manuel de Ayala sailed through the narrow strait that would later be spanned by the Golden Gate Bridge. He charted the rocky island and gave it a name, La Isla de los Alcatrazes, the Island of the Pelicans. At that time, the rock was nothing more than a nesting ground for seabirds, a desolate speck of sandstone in the cold Pacific waters. The native Miwok people, who had inhabited the Bay Area for thousands of years, regarded the island with deep suspicion. According to their oral traditions, evil spirits dwelled upon that rock. They used the island occasionally as a place to gather food, as a temporary campsite, but they warned their people against lingering there. Something about Alcatraz, they believed, was fundamentally wrong. It would take nearly a century for the island's dark destiny to begin taking shape. In 1850, President Millard Fillmore signed an executive order reserving Alcatraz for military use. The California Gold Rush had transformed San Francisco from a sleepy settlement into a booming metropolis practically overnight, and the federal government recognized the urgent need to defend the bay's entrance from foreign naval threats. The Army constructed a massive citadel atop the island and installed over 100 cannons, making Alcatraz the most heavily fortified military position on the entire West Coast. Together with Fort Point and Lime Point, the island formed a triangle of defense designed to protect the Golden Gate. Ironically, those cannons never fired a single shot in battle. The fortress that was built to repel foreign invaders found a very different purpose. By the late 1850s, the first military prisoners were being housed in the damp underground chambers beneath the citadel. During the Civil War, the cells filled with Union deserters, Confederate sympathizers, and citizens accused of treason. Later, Native Americans who resisted federal authority were shipped to the island in chains. Among them were 19 Hopi men whose only crime was refusing to allow the government to take their children away to boarding schools. Soldiers who had defected to the Filipino cause during the Spanish-American War were also imprisoned here, as were Chinese civilians who had resisted the army during the Boxer Rebellion. In 1854, a lighthouse was erected on the island, the first operational lighthouse on the entire Pacific coast. Its beam guided ships through the treacherous waters of the bay, a beacon of safety amid the fog and currents. But the lighthouse also served as an unintentional symbol. Alcatraz was already becoming a place where the light of the outside world was visible but utterly unreachable. By 1907, military prisoners were put to work constructing an enormous new structure atop the island. When it was completed in 1912, it was the largest reinforced concrete building in the world. The workers who built it became, with bitter irony, its first inmates. The old iron staircases and cell bars from the original citadel were reused in the new construction, a decision that would come back to haunt the authorities decades later, as those old, soft metal bars proved far easier to cut through than anyone had anticipated. In the early 1930s, America was drowning in crime. Prohibition had fueled the rise of organized crime syndicates, and gangsters like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and Pretty Boy Floyd had become household names. Bank robberies were epidemic. Kidnappings made daily headlines. The public was terrified, and the federal government was desperate for a solution. That solution was Alcatraz. In 1933, the Department of Justice acquired the island from the Army and set about transforming the aging military prison into the most secure federal penitentiary ever conceived. The goal was not rehabilitation. There would be no educational programs, no therapy, no path to redemption. Alcatraz was designed for one purpose only: punishment. It was meant to be the place where the most incorrigible, most dangerous, most escape-prone criminals in the entire federal system would be sent to learn one simple lesson, follow the rules, or suffer. The prison was redesigned with security measures that were revolutionary for the time. The old soft iron bars were replaced with hardened, tool-proof steel. Guard towers were positioned at strategic points around the island, manned by marksmen with orders to shoot to kill. The main cell house had a single entrance and exit. Every door, every corridor, every stairway was designed to funnel movement through choke points where guards could control the flow of prisoners. Metal detectors, a cutting-edge technology, in 1934 were installed at key locations. The inmates were counted a dozen times a day. Warden James A. Johnston, the prison's first chief administrator, was known as an iron-fisted disciplinarian. He had previously run San Quentin and Folsom prisons with an approach that balanced strict order with certain progressive ideas about prison labor. But at Alcatraz, Johnston implemented a regime of total control. Inmates had exactly 4 basic rights: food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Everything else, work, assignments, library access, recreational activities, family visits, even the ability to speak during meals had to be earned through perfect behavior. The silence rule was perhaps the most psychologically devastating regulation. For the first several years of the prison's operation, inmates were forbidden from speaking to one another, except during brief recreation periods. Imagine spending 23 hours a day in a tiny concrete cell, listening to nothing but the drip of water and the echo of footsteps on metal walkways, unable to exchange a single word with another human being. Many prisoners later said the silence was worse than any physical punishment. Cells were small, roughly 5 feet wide and 9 feet long, with a ceiling just over 7 feet high. Each contained a cot, a small shelf, a fold-down table, a toilet, and a sink. There were no windows in most cells. The walls were thick concrete. The doors made of heavy steel bars that offered no privacy whatsoever. Guards could see everything at all times. There was nowhere to hide, nothing to do, no escape from the relentless monotony. And yet there was one peculiar comfort that set Alcatraz apart from every other prison in the federal system. The food was exceptional. Warden Johnston believed that good food reduced violence and disorder, and he spared no expense on the prison kitchen. Meals at Alcatraz were legendary throughout the American penal system. Inmates ate better than many working-class Americans. The menu included fresh bread baked daily, real butter, quality meat, and vegetables. There were even occasional desserts. Remarkably, some inmates at other federal prisons actually requested transfers to Alcatraz specifically because of the food. They preferred the psychological torment of the island to the terrible meals at places like Atlanta or Leavenworth. But there was a sinister logic behind another seemingly humane amenity: hot showers. Unlike most prisons, Alcatraz provided its inmates with hot water for bathing. This was not a kindness. The administration wanted prisoners to grow accustomed to warm water so that the freezing temperatures of San Francisco Bay would seem even more terrifying. A man who hadn't felt cold water on his skin in months would think twice before plunging into the 50-degree Pacific. The daily routine at Alcatraz was a masterpiece of monotony, engineered to crush any spark of individuality or rebellion. Inmates were awakened at 6:30 each morning by a loud buzzer. They had 20 minutes to dress, make their beds to military standards, and stand at attention in front of their open cell doors for the first count of the day. Breakfast was served in the mess hall in strict silence during the early years, rows of men eating mechanically, the only sounds the clink of metal trays and the shuffle of feet. After breakfast came the work assignments, the workshops, the laundry, the kitchen, the maintenance details. Work was considered a privilege, not a punishment. And inmates who refused to work or who misbehaved were stripped of the right to labor and confined to their cells for 23 hours a day. Lunch was served at noon, followed by more work. Dinner came at 4, 30 inches the afternoon. By 5, the inmates were locked in their cells for the night. Lights went out at 9:30. And in between, in those long, empty hours between dinner and sleep, the men were left alone with their thoughts, their regrets, and the distant sounds of the city they could see but never touch. Recreation was limited and tightly controlled. On weekends and holidays, inmates who had earned the privilege were allowed time in the small concrete yard on the south side of the island. They could play softball, shuffleboard, or cards. Some painted. Some read books from the prison library, which contained a surprisingly good collection. A few played musical instruments. The prison band was one of the few genuine pleasures available. But even recreation was colored by the omnipresent surveillance. Guards watched from the towers above, rifles at the ready, and every man in the yard knew that a single wrong move could end in a bullet. Mail was a lifeline, but it was also a weapon of control. Every letter incoming and outgoing was read, censored, and sometimes confiscated by prison staff who searched for coded messages, escape plans, or any content deemed inappropriate. Visits were even more restricted. Inmates were permitted one visitor per month, and the visitor had to be pre-approved in writing by the warden. Known criminals were barred entirely. Visits took place through thick glass partitions, and conversations were monitored by guards. Physical contact was forbidden. For many inmates, these brief, glass-separated encounters with their families were the most painful part of their sentence, a cruel reminder of the life that was slipping away from them, 1 month at a time. For the families of the guards, life on Alcatraz was its own kind of imprisonment. The prison staff and their families lived in houses and apartments on the island, forming a small, isolated community surrounded by the most dangerous men in America. Children grew up playing in yards that overlooked the prison walls. They took the ferry to school on the mainland each morning and returned each evening to an island where their fathers spent their days watching over murderers and bank robbers. The children later recalled a strangely normal childhood. They had birthday parties, celebrated holidays, and played hide and seek among the fog-shrouded buildings. But they also remembered the ever-present sense of danger, the knowledge that something could go wrong at any moment, and the eerie silence that would fall over the island at night. The inmates who arrived at Alcatraz were not necessarily the men who had committed the most heinous crimes. They were the ones other prisons could not control: the escape artists, the rioters, the men who bribed guards, the psychopaths who terrorized fellow inmates, the ones who simply refused to follow any rule set before them. A transfer to Alcatraz was not a sentence handed down by a judge. It was an administrative decision, a last resort for the federal system's most unmanageable prisoners. The sinister reputation of the island spread through American prisons like wildfire. Every convict in the system knew what Alcatraz meant: isolation, deprivation, the constant presence of armed guards ready to kill. Follow the rules, or you'll end up on the rock. This was the most powerful threat a warden could make, and it worked. The mere existence of Alcatraz had an enormous deterrent effect on prisoner behavior across the entire federal system. The average population at any given time was roughly 260 to 275 inmates. The prison never once reached its maximum capacity of 336. For every prisoner, there could be up to 3 guards. This extraordinary ratio meant that inmates were watched constantly, their every movement monitored and recorded. The staff of 155, including guards, administrators, and support personnel, were among the most highly trained in the country. They were experts in security, though notably not in rehabilitation, because rehabilitation was never the point. Among the first inmates to arrive in August 1934 was the most famous gangster in American history, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known as Al Capone, designated prisoner number 85. Capone had ruled Chicago's criminal underworld throughout the Prohibition era, commanding an empire built on bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and murder. He was responsible for the infamous Street Valentine's Day Massacre. At his peak, he earned an estimated $60 million a year, an astronomical sum in Depression-era America. But the government couldn't pin any of his violent crimes on him. In the end, it was tax evasion that brought Capone down. At the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where he served the first part of his sentence, Capone had managed to maintain much of his power. He bribed guards to bring him luxuries, fine silk underwear, expensive cigars, imported food. His cell looked more like a hotel suite than a prison cell. He conducted business meetings and gave orders to his lieutenants on the outside. Alcatraz was meant to put an end to all of that. When Capone arrived on the island, the rules applied to him just like everyone else. His cell was the same size as every other cell, 5 by 9 feet of cold concrete. He was given the same clothing, the same meals, the same privileges as every other prisoner. No special treatment, no bribes, no business. The man who had once commanded an army of gangsters was now just another number. At first, Capone resisted. He tried to manipulate guards, attempted to use his reputation to intimidate other inmates, but Alcatraz broke him. "It looks like Alcatraz has got me licked," he reportedly told the warden. Stripped of his power, Capone retreated into himself. He took up music, playing the banjo and later the mandola in the prison band, a group called the Rock Islanders that gave regular Sunday concerts for the other inmates. He became, by all accounts, a model prisoner cooperative, quiet, and increasingly disconnected from reality. The syphilis he had contracted years earlier was slowly destroying his brain, and by the time he left Alcatraz in 1939, his mental faculties had severely deteriorated. He spent much of his final years in the prison hospital, confused and paranoid, a shadow of the man who had once terrorized an entire city. Another legendary figure who called Alcatraz home was George Kelly Barnes, better known as Machine Gun Kelly. Despite his fearsome nickname earned for his alleged mastery of the Thompson submachine gun, Kelly was, by many accounts, not nearly as dangerous as his reputation suggested. Much of his notoriety was manufactured by his wife, Catherine, who reportedly bought him his first machine gun and relentlessly promoted his criminal image. Kelly was convicted of kidnapping a wealthy oil businessman, and at Alcatraz, he was known as a remarkably well-behaved inmate who avoided trouble at all costs. He spent 17 years on the island. Then there was Mickey Cohen, the flamboyant gangster who controlled the Los Angeles underworld during the 1940s and 1950s. Cohen was obsessed with cleanliness. He washed his hands dozens of times a day and changed his clothes constantly. On the streets of LA, he was known for his sharp suits, expensive cars, and connections to Hollywood celebrities. At Alcatraz, he was just another man in a gray prison uniform. Alvin Karpis, known as Creepy Karpis due to his unsettling smile, holds the distinction of being the inmate who served the longest sentence on Alcatraz, a staggering 26 years. Once designated public enemy number 1 by the FBI, Karpis was personally arrested by J. Edgar Hoover himself, who wanted the publicity. On the island, Karpis became a skilled painter and musician, and he later wrote a memoir about his experiences. And then there was the most paradoxical prisoner of all, Robert Franklin Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz. Stroud's nickname is one of history's great ironies, because he never kept a single bird during his 17 years on the island. His legendary avian research had taken place at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, where he had been allowed to raise nearly 300 canaries in his cells, studying their diseases and behaviors with scientific rigor. He authored 2 influential books on ornithology and even developed and marketed medicines for bird ailments. But the real Robert Stroud was far from the gentle, misunderstood intellectual portrayed by Burt Lancaster in the 1962 film. Stroud was a convicted killer twice over. He first murdered a bartender in Alaska in 1909 when he was just 18. Then, while serving time at Leavenworth, he stabbed a prison guard to death in the mess hall in front of 1,100 inmates because his brother had been turned away during a visit. He was sentenced to death, but President Woodrow Wilson commuted his sentence to life in permanent solitary confinement after his mother's desperate campaign of letters and petitions. When Stroud arrived at Alcatraz in 1942, his birds and laboratory equipment were confiscated. Stripped of his life's work, he turned to studying law and writing a scathing history of the federal prison system, a manuscript the authorities refused to let him publish. A psychiatrist who evaluated him diagnosed him as a psychopath with above-average intelligence. Fellow inmates who knew him described him as manipulative, volatile, and dangerous. He was a vicious killer, one former Alcatraz prisoner later said. "I think Burt Lancaster owes us all an apology." Yet Stroud also showed unexpected courage during the bloody events of 1946, when armed inmates attempted an escape that became known as the Battle of Alcatraz. As gunfire erupted throughout the cell house, the 56-year-old Stroud climbed over the third-tier railing of D Block, lowered himself to the ground, and began closing the heavy steel doors of the isolation cells to protect the helpless men trapped inside. He then yelled to the guards that there were no firearms in D Block, begging them to stop shooting before innocent prisoners were killed. Stroud spent 42 of his 54 years in prison in solitary confinement, one of the longest stretches of isolation in American penal history. He never saw the film that immortalized him. He never gained his freedom. He died in a Missouri medical prison in 1963, the same year Alcatraz itself closed its doors forever. If Alcatraz itself was a punishment, then D Block was a punishment within that punishment, a prison inside a prison designed to break the spirits of men who are already among the most hardened criminals in America. Known officially as the treatment unit, D Block contained 42 cells, arranged in varying degrees of severity. But it was the 5 cells at the far end of the block that earned their terrifying nickname, the Hole. The Hole was the deepest circle of Alcatraz's particular hell. These were steel-lined chambers with no furniture, no sink, no proper toilet, just a hole in the floor. When an inmate was sent to the Hole, he was first stripped completely naked. Then the door was closed, and he was plunged into absolute darkness. No light, no sound, except his own breathing. No sense of time. He would remain there for anywhere from 1 to 19 days, fed minimal rations pushed through a slot in the door. The psychological effects were devastating. Men screamed until they lost their voices. Some banged their heads against the steel walls until they drew blood. Others sat in silence and simply went mad. The sensory deprivation was so complete that inmates reported hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing figures in the darkness, feeling unseen hands touching them. Cell 14D was considered the worst of all. Even today, visitors and National Park Service staff report that the cell is noticeably colder than the surrounding area, roughly 20 degrees colder by some accounts. Psychics who have visited the prison claim to feel overwhelming waves of terror and despair concentrated in the corners of the cell, where punished prisoners once crouched in the darkness. Some park rangers, hardened men and women not given to superstition, refused to enter cell 14D alone. One particularly disturbing story from the 1940s involves a prisoner who was thrown into the hole for violent behavior. Almost immediately, he began screaming that something was in the cell with him, a creature with glowing red eyes that was attacking him. The guards dismissed his cries as the ravings of a lunatic. The next morning, the prisoner was found dead. The official cause was listed as natural causes, but there were reportedly finger-shaped bruises on his throat. The following day, during the routine head count, guards noticed something impossible. There was one too many prisoners in the lineup. At the end of the row stood a figure that appeared to be the dead man. Before the shocked guards could react, the figure vanished. Whether these stories are true or embellished, the psychological torment of D Block was absolutely real. Ruth McCain, an inmate involved in a failed escape attempt, was confined to cell 14D for over 3 years, an almost unimaginable duration of isolation and sensory deprivation. Other inmates in the general population sometimes went to extraordinary lengths to avoid being sent to D Block. There were documented cases of prisoners who chopped off their own fingers with axes in the prison workshops, preferring deliberate self-mutilation to the horror of the Hole. Suicides were disturbingly common throughout Alcatraz's history, and many of them occurred in or were precipitated by time spent in D Block. 2 kilometers. That was all that separated the inmates of Alcatraz from freedom. On a clear day, they could see the city of San Francisco spread out before them, the buildings, the cars, the people going about their normal lives. They could hear the sounds of New Year's Eve celebrations drifting across the water. They could watch ships passing through the Golden Gate, heading to exotic destinations around the world. Freedom was right there, tantalizingly close, visible from every point on the island. But between the prison and the shore lay the most effective security barrier ever designed by nature. The waters of San Francisco Bay are fed by snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada mountains, keeping the temperature between 10 and 13 degrees Celsius year-round, cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes. The tidal currents are powerful and unpredictable, capable of sweeping even a strong swimmer out through the Golden Gate and into the open Pacific. And then there are the fog's dense, disorienting blankets of white that can descend without warning, reducing visibility to zero and making navigation by sight impossible. The prison administration encouraged a persistent myth that the bay was infested with man-eating sharks. In reality, the only sharks in San Francisco Bay are small, bottom-feeding varieties that pose no threat to humans. But the guards kept this fact to themselves, allowing the legend to serve as yet another psychological deterrent. Beyond the water, the island itself presented formidable obstacles. The prison sat atop the highest point of the rock, surrounded by steep cliffs that dropped anywhere from 6 to 15 meters to the waterline. A perimeter fence topped with barbed wire encircled the compound, monitored by guard towers, whose occupants had standing orders to use lethal force against anyone attempting to scale it. The cliffs were slippery with seawater and guano, offering virtually no handholds. And yet, despite all of this, despite the cold water, the currents, the cliffs, the fences, the armed guards, the fog, the mythical sharks, men still tried to escape. Over the 29 years that Alcatraz operated as a federal prison, 36 inmates made 14 separate attempts to break free. 23 were recaptured, 6 were shot and killed. 2 drowned. And 5 simply vanished into the bay, their fates officially unknown to this day. The first man to attempt an escape from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was Joseph Bowers, inmate number 210. It was the afternoon of the 27th of April, 1936, less than 2 years after the prison had opened. Bowers had been assigned to garbage detail, pushing a wheelbarrow full of refuse to the incinerator in the prison yard. It was mundane work, the kind of task that made the days blur together in an endless gray haze. Then, without warning, Bowers dropped his wheelbarrow and sprinted toward the perimeter fence. The guards in the nearest tower shouted for him to stop. He ignored them. He reached the fence and began climbing, his fingers clawing at the chain link with desperate intensity. He made it over the top. For one brief, wild moment, Joseph Bowers was on the other side. Then the guard opened fire. The bullet struck him, and Bowers tumbled from the cliff, a 15-meter fall to the rocks below. He was killed on impact. In a grim sense, Bowers achieved what he wanted. He died outside the prison walls. But his death set the tone for everything that would follow a bloody chronicle of desperation, ingenuity, and almost inevitable failure. What drove Bowers to make his suicidal dash remains unclear. He had been convicted of robbing a post office, a serious crime, but not one that typically earned a life sentence. Some historians believe he was mentally ill and that his escape attempt was less a calculated bid for freedom than a desperate, irrational act born of psychological breakdown. Others have pointed out that Bowers had been placed on garbage detail, which brought him closer to the perimeter fence than most inmates ever got, and that the temptation of being so close to the edge, so close to the cliff that separated prison from open air, may have simply overwhelmed whatever rational calculation he still possessed. Whatever his motivation, Bowers' death sent a clear and unmistakable message to every inmate on the island. The guards would shoot, and they would not miss. The administration made certain that every prisoner learned about what had happened. It was intended as a deterrent. For most men, it worked. But for a certain breed of inmate, the kind who had already attempted escape from every other prison they had been sent to, the kind for whom the idea of spending another decade behind bars was worse than death, the message had a different effect entirely. It told them that they needed to be smarter, more creative, and more patient than Joseph Bowers had been. In December 1937, 2 inmates named Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe discovered what many future escape artists would also learn: that the security in the prison's industrial workshops was considerably weaker than in the main cell house. Working patiently over weeks, they used stolen tools to saw through the bars of a workshop window. They had fashioned makeshift flotation devices from rubber tires and tin cans, crude but potentially effective in keeping them above water long enough to reach the shore. On the day of their escape, nature seemed to cooperate. A thick fog had rolled in off the Pacific, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The guards in the towers could barely see the perimeter, let alone the workshops. Cole and Rowe slipped through the window, cushioned their 6-meter jump from the cliff with the tires, and hit the water. The bay temperature that day was approximately 11 degrees Celsius, cold enough to steal the breath from a man's lungs on contact. And the fog that had hidden their escape now became their enemy. Disoriented, unable to see the shore or any landmark, they had no way to know which direction to swim. Were they heading toward freedom or being carried by the current out through the Golden Gate into the open ocean? Their bodies were never recovered. For a time, the FBI listed them as wanted fugitives, but they are now officially presumed dead, claimed by the same bay that had served as the prison's most reliable security measure. After their disappearance, the workshops were rebuilt with reinforced bars and improved surveillance. The following year saw a series of escape attempts that ranged from the desperate to the ingenious, all ending in failure. In 1938, 3 inmates decided on a frontal assault. They jumped a guard, beat him to death with a crowbar, and seized his weapon. It was a brutal, straightforward plan: kill the guards, take the guns, fight their way to freedom. But they had fatally underestimated the response. There were still hundreds of guards on the island, and the alarm was raised within minutes. 2 of the escapees were shot dead. The 3rd surrendered. In 1939, Arthur Doc Barker, a member of the infamous Barker-Karpus gang and one of the most feared criminals in America, orchestrated a more sophisticated attempt. Barker and 4 accomplices had discovered that the bars in certain cells dated back to the prison's military era and were made of soft steel that could be sawed through with patience and the right tools. Over weeks of careful work, they cut through the bars, then used an improvised jack to bend the outer bars of the building wide enough to slip through. They reached the shore and began assembling a makeshift raft from driftwood and scraps of material. But as they wandered along the waterline searching for wood, a guard in one of the towers spotted them against the rocks. He opened fire without hesitation. Barker took a bullet and fell. The other escapees were captured. The guard received a commendation, and every cell in the prison was refitted with new, hardened steel bars that no amount of sawing could penetrate. In 1941, a prisoner came up with a novel approach. He hid inside a garbage container and had himself carried to the shoreline as part of the regular waste disposal routine. The plan worked beautifully up to a point. He made it to the water's edge without being detected and slipped into the bay. He began swimming toward the distant lights of the city. But within 5 minutes, the freezing water began shutting down his muscles. His strokes grew weaker, his breathing more labored, his body temperature plummeting. Hypothermia was setting in with terrifying speed. Barely able to move, the escapee managed to turn around and swim back to the island, where he crawled ashore and surrendered to the guards, shivering and half dead. In 1943, 2 prisoners managed to overpower and bind 2 guards. While they struggled to break through the window bars, one of the tied-up guards performed an act of remarkable resourcefulness. He managed to wriggle close enough to his colleague to reach the emergency whistle hanging around the other man's neck. He blew it with enough force to alert the entire prison. The escapees, who had made it into the water and were clinging to stolen barrels, were fired upon by guards. One survivor managed to find a cave on the shoreline and hid there for 2 full days, surviving on nothing. But starvation eventually drove him back inside. He climbed through the same window he had used to escape and quietly returned to his cell. During World War II, the prison workshops at Alcatraz were repurposed to support the war effort. Inmates sewed uniforms for the United States Army, an ironic assignment, given that most of them had spent their lives fighting against American law and order. But war creates strange bedfellows, and the prisoners dutifully stitched and hemmed while the world burned. In 1945, one particularly resourceful inmate saw an opportunity. He managed to steal a complete sergeant's uniform from the workshop: jacket, trousers, cap, insignia, everything. On the appointed day, he put on the uniform, straightened his cap, and walked out of the workshop with the confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was. He strode across the yard, past the fence, down to the dock where the prison ferry was waiting. He boarded the boat without attracting a second glance. For those few minutes on the ferry ride across the bay, he must have felt the intoxicating rush of freedom, the salt wind on his face, the prison growing smaller behind him, the city growing closer. Then the ferry docked, and reality came crashing down. Guards at the mainland checkpoint were checking identification papers. The fake sergeant, of course, had none. He was apprehended, returned to the island, and sent to D Block for an extended stay in the hole. It was one of the most creative escape attempts in Alcatraz history, and like all the others, it ended in failure. Of all the violent episodes in Alcatraz's history, none was more dramatic or more bloody than the events that began on the afternoon of the 2nd of May, 1946, an event that would become known as the Battle of Alcatraz. The mastermind was Bernard Coy, a cunning bank robber from Kentucky serving a 25-year sentence. His chief accomplice was Joseph Kretzer, a hardened gangster whom the FBI had designated public enemy number 4. For months, Coy had been meticulously studying the guards' patrol routes, timing their movements to the second. He identified a critical vulnerability. The gun gallery above the cells was separated from the inmate area by only a metal grill, and the gaps between the bars were wider than they should have been. Coy had been deliberately starving himself for weeks, whittling down his body until he was thin enough to squeeze through those bars. On the afternoon of the escape, the cell block was staffed by 2 guards, one armed, one unarmed. The unarmed guard was lured into a trap and strangled into unconsciousness. When the armed guard returned from his patrol route, Coy was waiting. He overpowered the man, seized his ring of keys, his rifle, and his pistol. Armed and organized, Coy and his accomplices moved quickly through the cell block, disarming additional guards and releasing fellow inmates. Within minutes, they had accumulated 8 hostages and a small arsenal of weapons. A dozen prisoners were freed from their cells. The plan was simple: fight their way to the dock, seize a boat, and escape to the mainland. But the plan fell apart almost immediately. In the chaos of the moment, someone used the wrong key in a critical lock, and the mechanism jammed. The door that would have given them access to the prison yard and from there to the dock refused to open. The escapees were trapped in the cell block with their hostages, and it was only a matter of time before the alarm was raised. In a catastrophic coincidence, a new shift of guards chose that exact moment to enter the cell block. They walked directly into the arms of the armed prisoners. Now, the rioters had even more hostages, but they still couldn't get through the jammed door. What followed was a 2-day siege unlike anything that had ever occurred in an American prison. The inmates barricaded themselves inside the cell block and refused to surrender. When the prison administration realized they couldn't resolve the situation with their own forces, they made an unprecedented decision. They called in the United States Marines. The Marines who landed on Alcatraz had recently returned from some of the bloodiest fighting of the Pacific War, the beaches of Okinawa, the jungles of Iwo Jima. They treated the prison siege with the same professional lethality they had brought to the Japanese Imperial Army. Grenades were lobbed through windows and ventilation shafts. Rifle fire raked the cell block corridors. The concrete walls that had been designed to keep prisoners in now trapped them as targets. When the shooting finally stopped, 5 men were dead, 2 inmates killed in the fighting, and 3 guards murdered by the rioters during the siege. 14 others were wounded, some critically. The surviving ringleaders were put on trial. 2 were executed in San Quentin's gas chamber. The 3rd received an additional life sentence. The Battle of Alcatraz was a watershed moment. Security measures were dramatically tightened, and for the next 16 years, nothing on that scale would happen again. But the desire to escape the primal human need for freedom could not be locked behind steel doors. The siege made national headlines and shocked the American public. Newspapers ran banner stories about the armed confrontation between prisoners and Marines on a tiny island in San Francisco Bay. For the prison administration, it was both a disaster and a vindication. A disaster because inmates had managed to seize weapons and hold guards hostage for 2 days, but a vindication because the existing security infrastructure had ultimately contained the riot without a mass breakout. In the aftermath, the prison implemented a series of reforms. Guard patrols were restructured to eliminate the vulnerabilities that Coy had exploited. The gun gallery bars were replaced with narrower spacing. A new system of key management was introduced to prevent the catastrophic lockjamming that had thwarted the escapees' plan. Metal detectors were upgraded, and additional checkpoints were established throughout the facility. The message was clear. What had happened in May 1946 would never be allowed to happen again. For the inmates, the Battle of Alcatraz became a legend, a story whispered in the cells at night, passed from old-timers to newcomers. It was a story of both courage and futility, of men who had fought with everything they had and still lost. But it was also a story that kept hope alive. If Coy could squeeze through those bars, if Kreutzer could hold off the guards for 2 days, then maybe, just maybe, someone smarter, someone luckier, someone with a better plan could find a way to do what no one had done before, actually escape from the rock. And so we come to the escape that has captivated the world's imagination for over 60 years, the one attempt that may have actually succeeded. The legendary 1962 breakout of Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. Frank Lee Morris was, by any measure, a criminal genius. Born in 1,926 inches, Washington, D.C. He was orphaned as a child and raised in a series of foster homes. He was first arrested at age 13. By his 20s, he had compiled an impressive criminal resume, drug dealing, armed robbery, burglary, and an equally impressive escape record. He had broken out of multiple state and federal facilities, earning a reputation as one of the most escape-prone inmates in the system. His IQ was tested at 133, placing him in the upper 2% of the population. When he arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960, the authorities thought they had finally found a cage that could hold him. They were wrong. John and Clarence Anglin were brothers from rural Georgia who had grown up swimming in the icy waters of Lake Michigan, where their family had migrated for seasonal farm work. They were not violent criminals, their specialties were burglary and car theft, but they shared Morris's talent for escape. Both had broken out of other prisons before being sent to the island. Clarence arrived in 1961, and he was placed in a cell adjacent to Morris in Block B. The old ventilation shafts behind the walls of their cells would become the key to everything. The fourth member of the team was Alan West, a car thief and petty criminal who occupied the cell next to the others. West would play a crucial role in the planning, but would ultimately be left behind, and it is thanks to his detailed testimony that we know as much as we do about how the escape was executed. Morris was the architect of the plan. He had noticed that the concrete around the ventilation grills at the back of their cells was old, weakened by decades of salt, air, and moisture. Behind those grills lay a utility corridor, an unguarded service passage that ran the length of the cell block and provided access to the roof. If they could break through the wall, they could reach the corridor. From there, they could climb to the roof and make their way down to the water. The tools they used were ingenious. Morris fashioned a makeshift drill from a discarded spoon, a melted silver coin, and the motor from a vacuum cleaner. The drill was slow, agonizingly slow, but it worked. Each night, during the 1 hour when music was played over the prison's loudspeaker system to mask the noise, one of the conspirators would chip away at the concrete around his ventilation grill while the others stood watch. They fashioned crude periscopes from mirrors and cardboard to check for approaching guards. The work took over a year. Each night, they would chip away a few more centimeters of concrete, then carefully conceal the growing hole with a plug made from a mixture of shredded newspaper, water, and glue, painted to match the surrounding wall. The dust was disposed of in the prison yard during recreation periods, sprinkled inconspicuously across the ground. Meanwhile, the team was also preparing for the water crossing. Over months of patient bartering and theft, they accumulated more than 50 rubberized raincoats from other inmates. In the utility corridor above their cells, which they had secretly accessed and converted into a hidden workshop, they cut the raincoats into panels and carefully stitched them together to form a 6 by 14-foot inflatable raft. The seams were sealed using the hot steam pipes that ran through the corridor, essentially vulcanizing the rubber. They made life preservers from the same material and fashioned wooden paddles. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the preparation was the decoys. Using the same papier-mâché technique they had employed for the wall plugs, they sculpted life-size replicas of their own heads, complete with flesh-colored paint, carefully placed features, and real human hair stolen from the prison barbershop. These dummy heads were designed to fool the guards during the nighttime bed checks, buying the escapees precious hours before the alarm was raised. Everything was ready. On the night of the 11th of June, 1962, the plan was set in motion. Morris and the Anglin brothers placed the dummy heads on their pillows, arranged the blankets to simulate sleeping bodies, and crawled into the holes in the backs of their cells. Alan West, however, couldn't get through. Either his hole wasn't wide enough, or his nerve failed him at the critical moment. He stayed behind. The three men crawled through the utility corridor, climbed 10 meters up the narrow ventilation shaft to the roof, then shimmied down a drain pipe to the ground. They crossed the yard in the darkness, reached the water's edge, and inflated their rubber raft using a modified musical instrument, a concertina they had converted into a bellows. And then they paddled into the night. They were never seen again. The disappearance of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers triggered one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. The official investigation concluded that all three men had drowned in the frigid waters of the bay. The evidence seemed to support this verdict. On the far shore, police recovered a wallet wrapped in plastic. It contained photographs and addresses belonging to the Anglin family. Nearby, they found a homemade life vest with a broken valve and scraps of rubberized fabric. No bodies were ever found, but the authorities argued that this was not unusual. The bay's strong currents could easily carry a corpse out to sea. Case closed. Or was it? Over the decades since that June night in 1962, a steady stream of evidence has emerged suggesting that the official verdict may be wrong, that Morris and the Anglins may have survived. In 2011, National Geographic reported on a newly declassified FBI document that contradicted key elements of the official narrative. According to this report, the rubber raft was actually found not floating in the bay, as previously stated, but dragged into the bushes on the shore near the town of Angel Island. There were footprints leading away from the raft and into the surrounding area. This suggested that at least one person had reached land alive and had the presence of mind to hide the raft rather than abandon it in the water. There's also the matter of the car theft. On the 13th of June, 1962, just one day after the escape, three unidentified men hijacked a vehicle near San Francisco Bay, ejected the driver, and vanished. The perpetrators were never identified or apprehended. Then there are the flowers. After the escape, someone began sending flowers regularly to the Anglin brothers' mother in rural Georgia. When the flowers stopped, beautiful postcards arrived, postmarked from various locations in South America. The family received these mysterious missives for years. When the brothers' mother died in 1973, two peculiar women attended her funeral. According to family members, the women appeared to be tall, broad-shouldered men disguised in dresses and wigs. In 2013, the FBI received a letter, purportedly written by John Anglin. The letter claimed that John was suffering from cancer and wished to return home. He offered a deal. He would turn himself in and serve 1 additional year in prison in exchange for medical treatment. The FBI officially dismissed the letter as a hoax, but perhaps the most tantalizing piece of evidence emerged in 2020. The Irish Business Post reported that a new facial recognition system developed in Ireland had found a match in its database, a photograph taken in Brazil in 1975, showing two men smiling in sunglasses. The system identified them as John and Clarence Anglin, with a stated probability of 97%. To this day, the FBI maintains that all three escapees drowned. The case remains officially open. The truth, like the men themselves, has vanished into the fog. But the Anglin family has never given up hope. For decades, the brothers' surviving relatives have insisted that John and Clarence made it to freedom. The family has shared stories, photographs, and correspondence that they believe proves the brothers lived for years, possibly decades, after their escape. In 2015, a History Channel documentary featured the Anglin family's evidence, including a photograph allegedly taken in Brazil in the mid-1970s that appears to show two men bearing a striking resemblance to the brothers. The U.S. Marshal Service, which took over the investigation from the FBI, has kept the case open and active. They have stated publicly that they will continue to pursue any credible lead until the escapees are proven dead or reach the age of 99. As of the current day, neither condition has been met with certainty. Frank Morris, if alive, would be in his late 90s. The Anglin brothers would be in their mid-90s. The odds of their survival diminish with each passing year, but the mystery endures, a testament to the power of hope, ingenuity, and the unquenchable human desire for freedom. While the Anglin brothers' escape captured the world's imagination, there's another escape attempt that is often overlooked, one that proved beyond any doubt that the swim from Alcatraz to the mainland was physically possible. In December 1962, just 6 months after the famous breakout, inmate John Paul Scott managed to bend the bars of a kitchen window wide enough to slip through. He made his way to the water's edge and plunged into the bay. Unlike the other escapees, who had been defeated by the cold and the current, Scott actually made it to shore. He swam the entire distance, approximately 2.5 kilometers, through the freezing water and the powerful tidal currents. But the effort nearly killed him. When police discovered Scott at the base of the Golden Gate Bridge, he was unconscious. His body racked by severe hypothermia. He had no energy left to run, to hide, or even to move. He was returned to Alcatraz, but his swim proved an important point. The crossing was survivable. If a lone, unprepared inmate could make it to shore, what could 3 determined men with a rubber raft, paddles, and life vests accomplish? Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary closed its doors on the 21st of March 1963. The famous escape did not cause the closure. The decision had been made long before Morris and the Anglins made their bid for freedom. The real killer was economics. The island's total isolation, which had made it such an effective prison, also made it ruinously expensive to operate. Every single item needed on the island, food, clothing, medical supplies, building materials, and even fresh water, had to be transported by boat across the bay. The salt air and constant exposure to seawater were relentlessly destroying the buildings. By the early 1960s, an estimated $3 to $5 million would have been needed just for repairs and maintenance, not including the day-to-day operating costs that were already nearly 3 times higher than any other federal prison. In 1959, it cost over $10 per day to house an inmate at Alcatraz, compared to just $3 at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The last prisoners were transferred to other facilities. The lights went out, the ferries stopped running. The seabirds that had given the island its name reclaimed their ancestral nesting grounds. For 6 years, Alcatraz sat empty, a rusting, crumbling monument to an era of American criminal justice that was rapidly passing into history. But the story of Alcatraz did not end with the closing of the prison. In fact, one of its most significant chapters was yet to be written, and it had nothing to do with criminals, guards, or escape attempts. On the night of the 20th of November, 1969, 89 Native Americans, men, women, and children, from dozens of different tribes, set out in boats across San Francisco Bay and occupied Alcatraz Island. They called themselves Indians of all tribes, and they claimed the island under the provisions of an 1868 treaty between the United States and the Sioux, which stated that unused federal land should be returned to Native peoples. The abandoned prison, they argued, fit that description perfectly. The occupation was led by Richard Oakes, a charismatic young Mohawk student, and Lenata Means, a Shoshone-Bannock activist from the University of California at Berkeley. Their demands were both practical and symbolic. They wanted the island to become a center for Native American studies, a spiritual gathering place, and a museum that would tell the true story of how indigenous peoples had been treated by the United States government. The timing was not coincidental. Just weeks earlier, a fire had destroyed the San Francisco Indian Center, one of the few places in the city where urban Native Americans could gather, find employment assistance, receive healthcare, and maintain their cultural traditions. The loss of the center was devastating, and it ignited a long simmering anger about the federal government's ongoing policies of tribal termination, the systematic dissolution of tribal governments, and the seizure of native lands. The occupation would last for 19 months. At its peak, over 400 people lived on the island. They established a functioning community with its own governing council, kitchen, clinic, nursery, school, and security force. Humorously dubbed the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs, a pointed jab at the despised Bureau of Indian Affairs. A Sioux activist named John Trudell set up a radio station and began daily broadcasts under the banner of Radio Free Alcatraz, discussing native rights, cultural traditions, and the occupation itself. Support poured in from across the country. The rock band Creedence Clearwater Revival donated money to purchase a supply boat. Hollywood celebrities issued public statements of support. Thousands of dollars in cash, food, and clothing arrived from ordinary Americans who sympathized with the cause. But the occupation gradually deteriorated. Many of the original student organizers had to return to school, and they were replaced by newcomers with different agendas. Drugs and alcohol, originally banned on the island, began circulating. Tragedy struck in January 1970 when Oakes's 13-year-old stepdaughter, Yvonne, fell to her death from a stairwell on the island. The devastated Oakes family left Alcatraz, and with them went much of the occupation's moral authority. On the 11th of June, 1971, federal marshals landed on the island and removed the remaining 15 occupiers in less than 30 minutes without incident. But the occupation had achieved something profound. It focused national attention on Native American rights as never before. It helped end the disastrous policy of tribal termination. It inspired a wave of indigenous activism that continues to this day. And it ensured that Alcatraz's legacy would be remembered not just as a story of criminals and punishment, but also as a story of resistance and the fight for justice. Today, Alcatraz Island is a National Historic Landmark and one of San Francisco's most popular tourist attractions, drawing nearly 1.5 million visitors each year. They arrive by ferry from Pier 33, and as the boat crosses the bay, the island emerges from the mist like a scene from a nightmare, the concrete cell house looming at the top of the rock, the crumbling guard towers, the rusting metal fences, still topped with coils of barbed wire. But many visitors come seeking something beyond history. They come looking for ghosts. The paranormal reputation of Alcatraz is almost as famous as its criminal history. Reports of unexplained phenomena have been documented since the prison was still in operation. Guards in the 1940s and 1950s reported hearing phantom gunshots and screams so realistic that they dove for cover, believing that inmates had escaped and armed themselves. When they investigated, they found nothing. The old laundry room was plagued by episodes of thick, acrid smoke that would appear without warning and then vanish minutes later, leaving no trace. Even Warden Johnston, a deeply practical man not given to superstition, had his own encounters. During a holiday party at his residence on the island, guests reported seeing a man dressed in 19th century clothing standing among them. After a few moments, the figure vanished, and the fire in the fireplace went out. On another occasion, Johnston was giving a tour when his group heard the sound of a woman sobbing. As they searched for the source, a blast of freezing air swept through the corridor and the crying abruptly stopped. The spirit of Al Capone is said to haunt the shower room, where, in his final years on the island, he would hide to avoid the other inmates he had come to fear. Guards and visitors have reported hearing the faint strains of a banjo being played in the empty room, the same instrument Capone had mastered during his years on the Rock. Cell 14D, the most infamous of the solitary confinement chambers, remains the epicenter of paranormal activity. Visitors report sudden drops in temperature, intense feelings of dread and despair, and the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. In 1992, when the television program Sightings brought a psychic investigator to the prison, he claimed to hear the voices of men who had been driven insane by abuse, isolation, and fear. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, there is something undeniably unsettling about walking through the abandoned cell house of Alcatraz. The cells still contain the remnants of lives lived in desperation, faded photographs tacked to walls, scratches in the concrete left by fingernails, messages carved into steel. The echo of footsteps on the metal walkways sounds remarkably like the pacing of men who have nowhere to go. And sometimes, on a quiet day, when the fog rolls in off the bay, visitors swear they can hear something that might be the wind or might be something else entirely. Since 1981, the Escape from Alcatraz Triathlon has been held annually in the waters surrounding the island. The event begins with a 2.5-kilometer swim from Alcatraz to the shore, followed by a 29-kilometer bicycle ride and a 13-kilometer run through the streets of San Francisco. Each year, thousands of athletes complete the course, their wetsuits protecting them from the same freezing water that was supposed to make escape impossible. In many ways, the triathlon is the final word on the great debate. Was the swim from Alcatraz survivable? The answer, demonstrated year after year by ordinary civilians, not desperate, adrenaline-fueled criminals, but weekend athletes and casual swimmers, is an unequivocal yes. The water is cold, the current is strong, but with even minimal preparation and equipment, the crossing is entirely within human capability. This simple fact adds enormous weight to the theory that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived their escape in 1962. They had spent over a year preparing for that one night. They had a raft, paddles, and life vests. They had studied the currents and the tides. They knew exactly where they were going. If a hobbyist triathlete can make the swim in under an hour, is it really so hard to believe that 3 determined, well-prepared men could have done the same? The triathlon has become something of a pilgrimage for those fascinated by the Alcatraz story. Swimmers plunge into the same waters that swallowed so many desperate inmates, and as they stroke through the cold, dark bay, they experience firsthand the challenge that faced every man who ever tried to escape the rock. Some participants have described the eerie feeling of swimming away from the island, the same sensation that Cole and Rowe, that the Anglin brothers, that every doomed escapee must have felt as they left the concrete fortress behind and committed themselves to the mercy of the Pacific. For the competitors, the swim ends with cheering crowds, warm blankets, and the satisfaction of athletic achievement. For the men who made this same crossing without preparation, without wetsuits, and without the certainty of survival, it ended very differently. The triathlon is a celebration. The original swims were acts of primal desperation, but both share the same fundamental truth. The water between Alcatraz and freedom is cold, dark, and treacherous, but it is not impossible to cross. Alcatraz Island has worn many faces throughout its history. It was a nesting ground for pelicans, a sacred site feared by the Miwok people, a military fortress bristling with cannons, a lighthouse guiding ships through the fog, a prison for Civil War dissidents, a federal penitentiary for America's most dangerous criminals, a battleground between inmates and Marines, a symbol of Native American resistance, and now a museum visited by millions. But beneath all of these identities, Alcatraz is fundamentally a story about the human spirit, about the lengths people will go to for freedom, about the cruelty that institutions can inflict, about the resilience of those who refuse to accept their fate. Joseph Bowers ran toward the fence knowing he would probably die. Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe dove into freezing water with nothing but tire scraps and tin cans. Bernard Coy starved himself thin enough to squeeze through steel bars. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers spent a year drilling through concrete with a spoon. Every escape attempt from Alcatraz, successful or not, was an act of pure, desperate courage. Every plan, however doomed, was a testament to the ingenuity and determination that humans summon when they are pushed to the very limits of endurance. The prison is empty now. The cells are open, the guard towers unmanned, the guns silent. Seabirds nest in the crumbling watchtowers, and wildflowers grow in the cracks of the concrete yard where men once paced in circles, dreaming of the world across the water. The fog still rolls in, just as it did 60 years ago, wrapping the island in its cold embrace, hiding its secrets. And somewhere, perhaps in a dusty photograph from Brazil, perhaps in the fading memory of flowers sent to a mother in Georgia, perhaps in the ghostly echo of a banjo playing in an empty shower room, the men of Alcatraz are still there, still waiting, still watching. In May 2025, a new chapter was unexpectedly proposed when President Donald Trump suggested reopening the island as a prison for what he called America's most violent offenders. Historians and prison experts immediately noted the enormous practical and financial obstacles. The same salt-damaged buildings that forced the prison's closure in 1963 would require hundreds of millions of dollars to restore to functional condition. But the proposal itself was revealing. After more than 60 years, Alcatraz still holds a unique place in the American imagination, a symbol of absolute authority, of punishment without mercy, of a time when the government believed that some men were simply too dangerous to be allowed to live among other criminals. Whether the prison ever reopens or not, the island will continue to stand in San Francisco Bay, battered by wind and salt spray, its concrete walls slowly crumbling, its steel bars rusting away. The pelicans for whom the island was named have returned in force, nesting in the guard towers, where marksmen once stood ready to kill. Gardens that were lovingly tended by inmates and guards alike have been restored by volunteers, and roses and irises now bloom in the cracks of the prison yard. Every year, on the anniversary of the 1969 Native American occupation, indigenous peoples gather on the island for a sunrise ceremony, honoring the activists who reclaimed the rock and used it as a platform to demand justice. The ceremony is a reminder that Alcatraz's history is not just one of punishment and despair, it is also a history of courage, of resistance, and of the belief that even the most impregnable prison can be overcome. The island sits at the crossroads of so many American stories, stories of crime and punishment, of ambition and failure, of oppression and resistance. It is a place where the worst of human nature, the cruelty of the guards, the violence of the inmates, the indifference of the authorities, collided with the best of it. The ingenuity of the escapees, the bravery of the Native American occupiers, the resilience of the men who survived D-Block with their sanity intact. Alcatraz is, in the end, a mirror. What you see when you look at the rock depends entirely on what you bring with you. Still trying to escape.